thank you so much for coming this morning. I appreciate there were some long queues outside of Conservative Party conference, which was very much a surprise given the overall discussions around the number of people here, but I was stuck in a queue and had to queue jump, so don't tell Kemi, I suppose. But thank you so much for everyone being here. We've got a really interesting panel discussion on today, and it's on the nature of Britain's quango state. It's been a big project of ours over this year to look at why the quango state has evolved in the way it has. So just to give a quick bit of context, although the Conservative government from 2010 to 2024 actually cut the number of quangos overall, the percentage of government spending for which quangos are accountable and responsible for soared from 13% to 30%. So what you have are far fewer but far more powerful arm's length bodies responsible for far more government spending. And the context of this is really interesting because Labour's catastrophic collapse in the polls has many origins, but I think one of the fundamental causes is surely its complete inability to work out how to use the levers of the state to deliver on anything that could be described as a policy agenda, whether it's the OBR handcuffing the options available to the Chancellor, Britain's environmental quangos suppressing their house building plans, or NHS England acting as a block to reform in the health service. Labour have quickly found out when ministers pull levers, very little happens. And this was a situation I think that they were warned of by their Conservative predecessors when they came into office, but unfortunately Labour politicians really did buy into the delusion that for them things would be different. Once they were in power, once the adults were back in the room, everything would tick along just fine. And for us at the CPA, what this has demonstrated is that arguably the most important part of any policy agenda for the next Conservative government is going to be what on earth to do about the vast quangocracy that controls, as I said, around a third of total government expenditure, removing that government expenditure effectively from democratic accountability, certainly day-to-day democratic accountability, and areas responsible for huge areas of policy and delivery. And failure to deal with this, and it may not matter who is in office after the next election, Britain's quangocracy will continue to be in power. So I'll briefly introduce my panel. We've got Lord Maud of Horsham, and I'm not going to list all of his many roles in government and out of government, but most prominently for the purpose of this panel, he was Minister of State in the Cabinet Office from 2010 to 2015, so has, I'd say, unparalleled experience and understanding of the way that Britain's state works. We have Charlotte Pickles, the Director of the Restate think tank, Alex Burghardt, MP for Brentwood and Ongar and Shadow Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster and Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Julian Galley, Head of Research at Merlin Strategy, and Fred de Fossard, Director of Strategy at the Prosperity Institute. And I think we'll go from broadly right to left, although Alex is going to finish. So Lord Maud of Horsham, can I ask if you could please go first?
Sure, thank you very much, and good to be with you. Good to see the Taxpayer Alliance is in good heart and going full throttle. Never needed more than now. So look, quangos. The concern about quangos goes back a long way. The Thatcher opposition 50 years ago was talking about the quango state and the need, and an MP called Philip Holland, Sir Philip Holland, was the biggest quango hunter. And when I was first elected in 1983, as a very young, I stress, MP, he was that hunt was in full tilt, and when we were preparing to come back into government in 2010, we gave a lot of thought to this. The first interesting thing was the government did not know how many quangos there were, and we had a better count than the government did in opposition. Lots of uncertainties about how you define a quango. We worked out there were about 900. We committed to a cull. At the end of the cull, there were about 600. We cut the number by a third. A mixture of some were mergers, so kind of some were spun out, some were simply discontinued. So the ones that were spun out, like things like the River and Canals Trust, to become an outside, a kind of private civil society organisation, kind of owned by its members. English Heritage, we subsequently did the same thing. But the tests we applied were, first, does this activity need to be done at all? and quite often you find it doesn't. It might have been needed at some stage, but governments are pretty incontinent about setting things up, really, really bad about stopping doing them when they're not needed anymore. So lots of things just carry on without anyone really noticing. So does it need to be done at all? If it does need to be done, does it need to be done by the state? Or, as we decided with the River and Canals Trust, actually it didn't need to be owned by the state. It can be owned, it can be either privatized commercially or put out to a membership organization. And if it does need to be done the state, is there any reason why it shouldn't be done by a democratically accountable body, i.e. Ministers, a department accountable to a minister, accountable to Parliament or in local government? And is there a reason why it has to be independent of, separate from ministerial, from democratic accountability? And there are some things that do need to be, and that's, the Office of National Statistics should not be subject to ministerial interference because you want those statistics to be above suspicion, which they frankly haven't always been. But the presumption is that nothing should be done that is not through a democratically accountable organization. But that presumption can be overset, but it has to have quite a high bar before it's overset. So we, and then the final question is, if it does have to be done by the state and not in a way that's democratically accountable, can it be made much more efficient? And obviously there's less ability to impose that, but you can do that. And I had a big concern with a lot of the regulatory organizations, the self-financing regulatory organizations, on which who charge, who recover their running costs from the people and organizations they're regulating. And there is no constraint really on their efficiency, because any additional costs they simply pass on to the people they're regulating. So there's a big economic penalty that comes with that. And all of this is much more out of control than it was. And we put in, one of the things we put in place in the 2010 review was a requirement for triennial reviews, that every 3 years there should be a proper root and branch examination of every quango and needs to be done in a really tough way to decide, does this need to continue to exist? Those triennial reviews, I think, disappeared. I think they got turned into something else. And there was always a danger that these would become lip service, formulaic, tick the box, we've done that, without any really rigorous. And that has to be done in a really rigorous way. So that hasn't happened. But, I think the reality is that one of the reasons why there's been such a loss of trust in elected politicians is that the sense, even if governments had the capability and the desire to drive change for which they've been elected, for which they have a mandate, the growth of the quango state, the unaccountable quango state, has limited their ability to do it. And so politicians have become a bit defeatist and a bit kind of limited in ambition. And the result of that has been to compound the cynicism that the public have had about democratically elected governments, and hence the space for insurgents. And this is not just the case here, but it's the case in many Western democracies, insurgents to gain so much ground. And that was part of the impulse behind Brexit, the sense that there was a loss of the ability for a democratically elected government here to act in the interests of the people who had elected them. And that's part of the problem. But the next Conservative government will need to take this very seriously indeed.
Thank you, Lord Mauder. Charlotte?
I'm delighted to hear you use the word quangocracy, which was the title of our paper that we published back in February. So I'm going to claim that we coined that phrase, quangocracy, and that is what we're living in. And you've already heard that 60% of day-to-day spending goes out via public bodies or quangos or arm's-length bodies. There's also numerous different terms for these things. Lord Maud, I'm sure you'll not be shocked to know that we still don't know how many we have. We still don't have a definitive list of how many public bodies there are, despite the fact they're spending about £350 billion of taxpayers' money. That's how much money goes out via these quangos. And quangos vary, hugely from ones that we might legitimately, in fact, we should legitimately want to be entirely independent from political interference, and that could be because they need to provide completely impartial facts and figures, and it could also just be because you don't want political interference in it. But that in no way covers the full spectrum of the number of quangos and public bodies we have, and one of the ones that we're delighted to see has been announced to be abolished. In fact, we called for this all the way back in 2016, and then again 2 years ago, is NHS England, which obviously, if you were to point to an area where you feel that some form of democratic control and ability for a Secretary of State to actually be able to pull, however weak those levers might be, being able to pull those levers, then surely it would be the huge amount of taxpayers' money that is going into the health system. I'm sure, Francis, you already said with the triennial reviews, which is what's supposed to tell us whether we should continue having quangos, whether they're doing the things we want them to do, actually to work out what the hell they are actually doing, given that the transparency is so woeful in public bodies. They are not being done in the same way as you wanted them set up. And actually, I, for my sins, have sat on a public body, a quango, myself, after I left government in the coalition, and we did have a triennial review, and I remember going through it, and I can tell you it was a total farce. And it was actually people within the department that was hosting the quango that was doing the review, and one might call that marking your own homework, because I'm not sure why a department would turn around and say the body that they're supposed to sponsor is not doing a good job, because that's essentially admitting that you failed in your sponsorship role. And that sponsorship role is also a really important bit which we don't always talk about. So there are a bunch of quangos. You can go and look at our report, Quangocracies are an annex. We went through all of the public bodies that are listed by the Cabinet Office, and we literally said you should shut this one, you should shut this one. We've completely done the work for the government. They can just pick it up and they can act on it. But for those bodies that should remain independent, you still need really strong accountability. You still need transparency. You need to know how they're spending their money and how they're taking decisions and whether they are aligned with what the government of the day wants them to do. And I'll just give you two figures which I think are fascinating, and these were from freedom of information requests that we put into government and the public bodies as part of our report. And the first one was to try and find out how many people in departments are actually responsible for interacting with kind of oversight, understanding what public bodies are doing. So if I tell you that there are about 400,000 people who work in public bodies, anyone want to make a guess of how many people in government are overseeing or are responsible for, quote, sponsoring and looking after that? Anyone want to just shout out a number? 10,000. Gosh, wouldn't that be great? It's about 250. And obviously, there will be other people in government departments that are working with the quangos and the bodies. But the people who are actually responsible for auditing, whether that's financially or in terms of activities, there is barely anyone doing it. So it's no wonder we don't really understand what's happening. And the other stat, which is a bit flippant, but I'm going to use it anyway, because I think it is a really good illustration of where we might be going wrong. So we also FOI'd how many people in public bodies are working in public affairs, in comms, or in kind of external engagement. So the sort of stuff that a company might have because you want to be able to lobby government, and that is one of the things that public bodies do, lobby government, i.e. the thing that owns them and runs them. And we wanted to find out, so how many people work in it? Over 100 public bodies just couldn't tell us or wouldn't tell us as a result of this. So this figure that I will give you is a very conservative number. It will be much higher than this. But the information we did get, there are over 5,000 people in public bodies doing that. If I tell you that the Treasury has, 3,500 people working in it, the entire Treasury, and there are 5,000 people doing comms and external affairs in public bodies. And this is why taxpayers, in part, are frustrated, because we don't really know what's going on. Ministers are sitting there unable to drive the priorities that they have been democratically elected to drive for the public. and they're sitting there saying, well, why is this money being spent on this stuff that I don't really understand why they're doing this? So I think there are a huge number of challenges, whether that is the actual quality of data that we have about these bodies, whether those bodies should exist, whether we have enough strong management of them. But I'll just leave you with one quote that we were given. So we spoke to a lot of officials within government right now who are trying to grip this problem, some of whom desperately would like to change this landscape. I mean, genuinely are very, very frustrated. And one said to us, the trouble is that there are too many people who are sitting in public bodies who are confusing independence with unaccountability. And that, for me, is the quote that summarises the problem we have with living in a quangocracy.
Very good.
Thank you, Charlotte. Julian, we'll go to you next.
Thank you, Elliot. Actually, what Charlotte ended on about independence and accountability is where I would like to start with, because on the surface, public opinion towards quangos can be quite confusing. Because in focus groups, when you ask people, who would you like to monitor a certain service, implement a policy, regulate AI, independent body is where voters go. They don't trust politicians to do it. They don't trust the government. They don't trust any of the parties to do it. So an independent body looks like an attractive option. However, over time, this actually leads to a loss of trust in politics, in politicians, and in our democratic system, because decisions are taken by unelected officials. And we see that those officials with no mandate are taking policy decisions which affect taxpayers, which affect voters. And when you look at the people in those quangos, those people working for government bodies, independent bodies, they are actually less in touch with voters across the country than politicians are. They don't have a constituency which they need to go to. They're not forced to go to high streets in Runcorn and see the devastation to services, to the high street, to job losses. They're able to sit in Whitehall in London, in metropolitan cities, and look at spreadsheets about the impact of their policies. They're not confronted by journalists showing them pictures of children on the NHS floor. They're not confronted by journalists interviewing them on media asking why certain things are failing. So that accountability doesn't just come from being voted out or being fired. That accountability comes from being questioned by media, being questioned by voters. If an NHS dentist collapses in a constituency, that MP is going to hear about it, whether that's through emails, whether that's through their surgeries. The MP is accountable and will hear about the issues that their voters are facing. Officials in quangos don't face that same responsibility, that same accountability to voters. And although in focus groups independent bodies might be attractive, in our polling we see that voters are incredibly desperate for decisions to be taken by elected officials. 3 in 4 voters, 3 in 4 Brits say that the final decision at all times has to be taken by an elected official. And we see that in their voting behaviour. Voting for things like Brexit is all about taking power away from unelected bureaucrats in Europe and bringing it to their elected politicians. For too many years, voters have seen politicians, prime ministers from both parties say, this is not our decision, this was made by Europe. And voters became fed up with that. And that this is the same issue we are seeing with quangos. So currently, 2 in 3 say too many decisions are being taken by unelected officials, by experts, by people who have no accountability, who are not elected officials, not politicians, and they would like that to change. We see that Brits think there's not enough accountability to those government departments. They don't know who they are. They don't know if they can be fired, if they can be promoted, demoted, and they're not clearly there because of performance-based issues. Now, the way to reverse that and to build trust in politics, in politicians, is for politicians themselves to take responsibility of the issues, for them to take it back into their remit and make decisions which they were elected to, which they have a mandate to carry out. This can boost trust in politics and make the role of quangos largely redundant. So politicians need to take back control, need to put their own decisions and not deflect their policy choices onto quangos, which can then take those decisions with no accountability. If they do so, they will reap the electoral rewards, because if they fail to do so and push hard decisions onto quangos, it is still the MPs, the elected politicians, the parties who will be held accountable at the next election. There's no use a Conservative or Labour government saying the NHS is failing because of Public Health England, because of NHS England. It's still the party that will be voted out. So it is for the survival of politicians, for the survival of political parties, for them to take back control of these decisions and to reduce the scope of quangos across the country.
Thank you, Julian. Fred.
Thank you very much. At the panel event just before this, we were talking about the restoration of parliamentary sovereignty with the ECHR. Two panelists have just talked about Brexit, and the quango discussion is quite reminiscent of Brexit, not just thematically, but also quite specifically. When I was looking at the sort of quango architecture at my time in government, in the Cabinet Office and other places, and subsequently, I sort of realised that much of this architecture made sense when Britain was in the European Union because of the way accountability worked in the European Union. Many quangos were set up as what the European Union called competent authorities to implement European Union regulations in their member states. We've obviously left the European Union, great thing too, but now we still have those competent authorities essentially in place, kind of unmoored with no form of accountability. And that's leading to a very, very strange situation where quangos such as the Financial Conduct Authority seem to take far, far greater political decisions in a way which I think is quite extraordinary. Because I don't have a huge amount of time, I will talk about a couple of FCA things which I think really highlight some of the problems and then suggest some solutions. The FCA, for example, at the moment is consulting on a new policy of banning non-financial misconduct in the City of London. This is a financial conduct authority implementing rules on non-financial conduct. That, I think, is extraordinary. And the justification they have, they're using for rules on non-financial misconduct is essentially straight out of the diversity, equality, inclusion playbook. They're talking about safer workplaces. They're explicitly referring to the public sector equality duty and the reasons they want to do that. And they also had a policy which they have currently shelved following political outrage to impose diversity reporting and hiring requirements on all regulated firms in the City of London. So that's not just publicly traded listed companies, that's tiny startups which might employ 10 people then having to do diversity reporting requirements. It is quite an insane leap that an appointed unelected regulator which does not report to a minister is applying the public sector equality duty, which is about internal management of public sector processes, to private businesses that it regulates for the most important part of the British economy. I think it's a really good constitutional example of how the quango state has jumped the shark and leapt into the political realm. And I think it's a very, very good thing, a very good example that all people in this room and politicians on the right in particular need to charge at them and use this as a thing to change. But the problem is also politicians. It's not just power-hungry regulators, but I do think the FCA is a particularly power-hungry regulator. The Competition and Markets Authority was recently given vast new powers in the Digital Markets, Competition and Consumers Act to regulate the digital economy. Some of those powers mean that the Competition and Markets Authority will have the ability to demand the redesign of a tech company's algorithm. They could fine these tech companies if they believe they're too large and dominant, 10% of their global turnover. They're trying to regulate actions which happen way beyond Britain and don't necessarily concern Britain. And they are doing this, I think, in an extraordinary way, and it's a great example of regulatory overreach. But of course, they only have these powers because these powers were given to them by politicians on a bill which had a huge amount of cross-party support. So back to Julian's point, we definitely do need politicians, parliamentarians, and a political class that actually wants to govern the country again and isn't afraid of it. One thing I tried to implement when I was in the Cabinet Office very briefly in 2022, because I worked for Jacob Rees-Mogg when he was a minister, and he had authority to approve the appointment of new quangos. We said that every new quango should have a sunset clause in it to try and beef up the triennial review point. Because I like the idea of the triennial review, but clearly it just hasn't worked, hasn't had enough teeth. But a sunset clause where it comes to be where the quango has a 5-year timeline and the House of Commons then votes whether to continue it or not after a debate, and we could set the time and terms for the debate, I think would be a good way of providing a bit more public accountability. And I feel that could be a nice little tweak to things going forward. It would be nice to say we're abolishing all quangos. We're clearly not going to abolish all quangos, and arm's length bodies do serve a certain purpose. But by providing greater democratic override to their decision making and things like sunset clauses in Parliament, I think we can make a lot of headway in getting rid of some of the worst aspects that we've discussed this morning.
Thank you, Fred, and finally, Alex.
Thank you very much, Elliot, and thank you. Look, thank you very much for having me here. It's sort of this is one of those questions to which one suspects one already knows the answer. Should we dismantle the Quango state? And we have the kind of Avengers assemble of dismantling the Quango state at this table, and I think on top of the excellent comments that other panelists have already made, I will say this. I think there is a growing consensus, indeed perhaps an achieved consensus, that we have to move back to a world in which ministers can make decisions. And if people don't like those decisions, then there are elections. And this is the only way in which we are going to be able to make sure that politics can deliver or attempt to deliver on the mandate that it receives from the public. And to do that, we need to locate power, responsibility, and accountability in the same place. And the obvious place to locate it is in the ministerial office. Now, to get there requires several things to change. Quangos are one part of that. And we've heard Fred's just been giving some very good examples of how quangos can go rogue and can stray off piste and acquire for themselves to a certain extent unchallenged authority in a way that was never intended by the people who brought them about. But I think we have to remember why we've gotten into this condition. Part of it, as Fred was said, was the EU, but there are other issues afoot. Not least, as I saw when I was in the Cabinet Office, as I was for 2 years before the general election, because sometimes quangos are established in order to get round Treasury rules. This is one of the reasons why NHS England was set up in the first place. It was considered that the Department for Health was too bureaucratic, that the pay bands were too restrictive, that the head count was too restrictive, and if you set up an independent body, it would have more freedom. And it's now been moved back into the Department of Health. I welcome the abolition of NHS England. However, it's moving back into an environment in which it doesn't have it won't have the freedom and flexibility to make many of the improvements that people assume it will achieve just by having ministerial oversight. Which is to say that we can't, if we just go in and start relocating quangos in departments, that of itself will not solve the whole problem. There are many other things we need to do as well. As Francis was saying, we have to have an attitude of starting by saying, what are we not going to do anymore? What does not need to be done? And let us get rid of it. We then have to say, of what is left, what requires political oversight, what would usefully have political oversight, and what doesn't. I think in this day and age, we also need to be able to ask, what can be automated? There are a large number of government functions that I saw when I was in the Cabinet Office that now could easily be replaced by AI, and then you're left with a rump of quangos that have to be quangos. You also have to deal with the issue of ministerial capacity, in that it's no good if we start to relocate a whole load of power and responsibility and ministers don't have time to genuinely, and ministers and their teams don't have time to genuinely engage with those functions. Which again brings us back to making sure that we are deciding what it is we're going to focus on and what it is we're not going to do anymore. And I think that is really at the heart of a lot of problems that the state has faced over many years. A failure to decide what we're not going to do, and a failure to resist being sucked into new things. So having all of these things in mind when considering quangos is essential if we're going to make sure that the next Conservative government can actually deliver on the very necessary things it needs to do.
Thank you, Alex. We're going to open the floor to questions, but I'm just going to take chair's prerogative for a couple. And I just want, particularly Lord Maud, I want to ask if you mentioned in your comments that you spent a lot of time in opposition thinking about what you were going to do when you got into power. Are there any lessons from that time that you spent that you can impart to the current opposition and the current leadership?
Well, I mean, time spent in preparation is absolutely essential, as the current government's manifest failure to prepare.
Yep.
It was as if the kind of snap election, oh my God, we're going to be a government. No one told us. And total failure to prepare. And it isn't that the plans are essential, but the planning is, I think it was Eisenhower who said, it isn't the plans that matter, it's the planning, because as we know, no plan survives first contact with reality. But you have to have surveyed, you know what it is you're taking on. And I can't stress too much this feature of people being told, ministers being told in government that they can't do things. The most commonly heard words in my office when I was a minister was, show me the chapter and verse. Show me where it says we can't do this. And so often, 9 times out of 10, it would disappear like Scotch mist. And it wasn't always that we were being told deliberate untruths, although sometimes that was the case. It was people make assumptions. We're not allowed to do that. We talk about data sharing, crucial to improve efficiency and effectiveness. And it was just assumed you can't do that. Well, show me where it says that. We had a big open data program, hugely important for increasing accountability. And we tapped into, and government sits on vast amounts of data, all of which is provided by the public, effectively. And when we pressed bits of government to release databases, we tapped into this very rich vein of creativity, people finding reasons why it couldn't be done. And in those days we were in the EU, so EU won't let us. There are legal reasons, national security, commercial confidentiality. And the thing they always came up with at the end was, but Minister, the quality of the data isn't very good, so we need time to improve the quality. To which my answer was always, publish it, and you'll find it gets better quite quickly. And so you just have to, ministers need the confidence to question what they're told. And it's hard work, and it's harder work than it need to be. The last review I did for the government on the governance and accountability of the civil service, I thought when I embarked on it, I thought I knew what all the answers were. But then when I delved into it more, I found things about the way in which our machinery of government is set up that is so fundamentally wrong and out of kilter with every equivalent system. So if you look at Canada, Australia, Ireland, New Zealand, all of which are Westminster-style parliamentary democracies with a permanent, politically impartial civil service, they're all set up differently from how we're set up. And the next Conservative government needs to rewire the central structure of government in a fairly fundamental way, because otherwise we will find ourselves with all the same frustrations, with ministers, those ministers who want to do the work and make things happen. It is actually a Labour minister in the current government who asked me to come in and give advice on how to make things work better. At the end of it, I was told, this is so much harder than I thought it would be. Most weeks I just find it's completely soul-destroying. And she wasn't talking about the politics, she was just talking about the difficulties for, in that case, a capable minister trying to get things done in a system which is very resistant. Not always deliberately, but just not set up to be able to make change happen.
Alex, I just want to pick up on this point, because one of the issues with focusing on rewiring the state is you end up spending all your time on how you deliver something and not what you deliver. And of course, for an electorate that will be hungry for answers, that might be quite frustrating, because it just delays the point at which you can start making significant difference to people's lives. How do you balance that difficulty of firstly making sure you're rewiring the state so you can deliver things better in the future, but then also making sure that you're not spending your whole time on essentially internal bureaucratic reform?
Well, obviously you have to do both, and it's not just about the what, it's also about the how. It's not just about the how, it's also about the what. And a very good example of that yesterday, Elliot, was Lord Wolfson's report on the European Convention on Human Rights.
Excellent.
Which was, I think, I was talking to a colleague about this earlier this morning, and actually, you look at that report, 200 pages of very, very high quality legal text. And I thought, actually, if somebody went into government and said to the civil service, give us legal advice on whether we should leave the ECHR and how we would do it if we did, you would not get anything of that quality. And it's only doing it in opposition that gives you the opportunity to do it to that very high standard. And I think that is, you know, I know that Francis and his colleagues did some of this in the run-up to 2010, being ready to enter government and knowing, again, not just what you want to do, but how you are going to do it. To have gone through those thought processes, to understand the nature of the beast and to know how it moves and to know how to tame it. Even if one confronts unexpected problems, as Francis says, you just, doesn't survive first contact with the enemy. At least, you understand what your enemy is like. And I think that we are, the sort of work that Kemi has commissioned is exactly along these lines. We will do the detailed thinking now. We will think about not just what we want to achieve, but how we are going to do it. And we will make sure that, should we win the next election, we are fully tooled up.
Thank you. And just finally, one more from me before we go to the audience. Fred, you mentioned the issue of politicians not wanting to take accountability and not wanting to take power, and that being one of the root causes of why the quango state has opened up. Do you have any thoughts on how you reform the system of electing MPs, picking candidates to ensure that we actually have a quota of MPs that genuinely want to deliver and genuinely want to be accountable and to take power?
That's a great question. We should ask all candidates whether they support the existence of a football regulator as a starting point. I think as the worst example of a quango created in the last potentially ever, a solution searching for a problem, a really terrible example of something must be done because I think Bury went bankrupt and then there's a new club which has replaced it anyway. But anyway, these are actually quite important guiding questions for what we ask of MPs. A lot of people bemoan the how MPs have turned into what people call the super councillor kind of MP, and I can completely understand how that develops because the incentives in front of MPs are as such, and the media environment that they work in, particularly online and particularly for the local pressures, you can see how these things feed into one another, and when so much legislation in Whitehall is written by civil servants and presented by ministers who don't read the legislation anyway. Programme motions are as such that time and scrutiny for legislation in Parliament has been reduced. A huge amount of stuff has to be changed, but it also has to be led by MPs themselves, because the only people that really can run the House of Commons are MPs themselves. And right now, maybe because the size of the government's majority has sort of hollowed out the real relevance of Parliament, but right now there is Parliament is not the legislature that it should be. But at the moment, that's the way MPs like it. I read a fascinating story in Politico a while ago where Labour MPs were saying legislation is getting in the way of them doing their actual jobs. So that is a big philosophical thing. But partly way of changing that is you need to really motivate a core of future legislators who are involved in as much of the planning that we've just discussed, whether that's the whole think tank ecosystem, collecting and developing ideas and getting together and realizing that the great potential they have with a sovereign parliament is that they can fix things. So maybe I don't think we should go to an American style situation where all congressmen are tabling bills left, right and centre. I think standing order 14 is a good thing, that the government legislation takes priority, but I'm sure there is a way we can start engaging a new generation of legislator MPs.
Thank you, Fred. Julian, Charlotte, anything you want to comment on any of those issues? Or
Yeah, just that at the end of the day, it's the MPs that will get voted out, so they need to take responsibility of their decisions. And yeah, in terms of legislation, I think we've got too many MPs have a local focus on their constituency, where actually a lot of the services, a lot of the priorities, immigration, it's all at a national level, it's all with legislation. So yeah, they need to go back into Parliament, back into more legislation, more time thinking about national issues, which will then impact local level politics much more efficiently.
Thank you. We'll throw it open to questions. Put your hands up, say who you are briefly, say who your question is addressing, and if we keep the question short and end it, make sure it is actually a question. We'll go to the lady at the front first. We've got microphones moving around. Thank you.
Is this on?
Yes. It is, yeah.
I'm Charlotte Kenyon. I'm a West Sussex County Councillor. It's been an absolutely great session, and I see Lord Maud smiling because I've been in sessions with you over many years on this, Lord Maud. So my question will be for you. So as a local representative, one of the problems, so many good comments made about this, is the public think that their elected representatives have a lot more control than they do. And these issues of the fondness for delegating authority as a means to avoid association with perhaps unpopular decisions, which is going to be a very hard habit to break, and awareness of what's actually going on, certainly in terms of, say, the seeping in of the whole DEI agenda, which has knocked organisations like the ONS off course, famously, and the love of even our Prime Minister to say, well, yeah, that spying case collapsed because the CPS made that decision. That's a hard habit to break. Lord Maud, you've been on this mission for such a long time. In practical terms, how are we going to crack this nut? Thank you.
Well, people have to want it. I mean, politicians, I struggle to understand the thing of politicians not wanting to take responsibility. What's the point of doing this unless you want to make things happen? I mean, we're not doing this for the money, certainly not doing it for the glamour. You're doing it for the often the fun of making something happen that you believe in and you believe is going to make the world a better place. Why would you not want to do that? And unless you're willing to take responsibility, you're not going to be able to make it happen. If you're going to delegate everything, I mean, one of the things, questions I asked myself in the this review I did on governance accountability is, it's a fairly fundamental principle that accountability and authority ought to be aligned. Now, if you're a minister, you have pretty much total accountability for everything that's done by your department. The whole quango world is different because that's at least one remove. But your authority to make it happen is severely truncated. You've broadly, collectively got control over the financial resources, but you do not have control over the other essential element, the human resources, because you do not have the ability, apart from at the margins, to put in place the people who are needed for whose actions you are going to be held accountable. And it isn't that you need to go to a complete kind of American administration system where all the kind of senior roles, because that has appointed by the politicians, because that has lots of disadvantages as well. But our system is out of kilter with others, and it is a deep frustration that your ability to make things happen as a minister. And I think it's less so in local government, actually. And this minister I was referring to had been leader of a London council. And they said, when I was leader of that council, if I said something should happen, it did happen. As a minister in national government, if I say something should happen, it's at best a kind of 50-50 shot. And that we need to align this much, much better. But the starting point is you've got to want to be in there. You've got to want to take charge and make things happen. And the system is, and there are lots of really, really good civil servants, and the good ones are incredibly frustrated by it. I remember when we started in 2010, we had a commitment in the manifesto to introduce a program of public service mutuals. It was very, very successful. We spun out of the public sector over 100 into nearly all of them not-for-profit civil society organizations delivering a public service. Huge improvements in productivity, lower cost, better quality services, and out of the public sector. And when I started, this lovely collection of civil servants said, well, Minister, you'll want first to have a green paper, and then you'll want to have a white paper, and then we'll need some legislation. And I said, no, not going to do any of that. You're going to find me 12 trailblazer, 12 groups of public sector workers who are interested in doing this, and we will support them. to do it. We will hothouse them to make them successful, and those will be the groundbreakers. And we'll build the whole program off the back of that. It's the JFDI school of government. Just do it, and make some things happen. Build momentum. Be dynamic. But coming back to that point, you've got to want to make things happen, and to understand. The advice I always gave to in the 2010 government, because I was an old hand, been around. I used to do induction for new ministers. And the first thing I was to say to them is, never underestimate how much you can get done. When you're told you can't do it, 9 times out of 10, you'll be presented with a brick wall, what looks like a brick wall, but it's made of paper, and you can walk through it. 1 time out of 10, it will be a brick wall, but you need to test it first.
Thank you. We'll take the lady on the second row here, sort of just in the middle. We've got a mic coming round.
Thank you very much. My name is Carol Traves. I'm a chartered town planner, and we run a business. I run a business with my husband, Peter, who's an architect. We build small family homes locally. We design and build them. Natural England, every few years, we get a bomb from Natural England. An embargo. Can't build. Can't grant planning permission. The houses that we've built, we can't have them occupied because they won't discharge our planning conditions unless we pay them money. And at the moment, we have biodiversity net gain.
I think that's called a racket.
Agreed. A very profitable one for Natural England. At the moment, we have biodiversity net gain, we have nutrient neutrality, we have Dorset heathlands mitigation. Now we have recreational contributions. On a 3-bedroom house, that adds about £45,000 from Natural England. So my request to Mr. Burghardt and to Lord Maud, in preparation for getting back into government in 2029, please merge Natural England with the Environment Agency. Do it quietly. Call it Environment England or something, and bring it back in control, because the councils are shocked when they have these bombs dropped from Natural England using the habitats regulations to beat up central government and local government. The councils can't fulfill their housing requirement numbers. Our members of parliament are hugely frustrated by it. Everyone is hamstrung by it. And what we're not going to be doing is building the homes that we need, that everyone keeps saying we need these homes, but nobody talks about Natural England as one of the worst quangos to stop house building in England.
I think I'll go to Alex, but I think there's probably some people on this panel that would just abolish both of them, but rather than merging. But
well, look, Carol, it won't surprise you to hear that we have a list. And would you? It was a really, really good case study there. Will you email me? You find my email on the parliamentary website, and we'll have a chat. But look, this is it. You have brilliantly articulated exactly the sort of problems that we're facing and the sort of problems that we need to overcome.
To make the accountability problem even worse, those habitat regulations you're talking about are European Union law as well.
More questions. We'll go to this gentleman, sort of closest, third row back. Yeah.
Hi, Anthony Breach, Director of Research at Centre for Cities. So Lord Maud has touched on this, but it might be a question for him or perhaps Charlotte. What's the role of devolution and local government and the metro mayors in squashing the quangocracy?
Can I take a shot of that?
Yeah.
What a great question. Thank you very much. So I think this is actually one of the areas. So a great point was made, I think probably by Alex, that you can abolish, whatever public bodies you want, but actually if the entity you're putting it back into is not fit for purpose, of which many of them are not, then that's not going to solve your problem, right? one of the problems is that there are too many public bodies which are sitting in central government, and again, we've had this illustrated brilliantly on the panel, are just too distant from understanding what's actually going on the ground. And so, for example, when we called for the abolishment of NHS England, brilliant, they've done it. We didn't say hand it back to the department and carry on, guys, business as usual. We said, you know what, actually, most local areas know what their health need is. You should devolve massive parts of the NHS. You need to maintain standards. You need to ensure that you've got accountability structures. You need the data so that you can actually hold areas to account. But my God, do you seriously think that in Whitehall, the Secretary of State should be deciding the type of health service that are being delivered in a locality that looks so fundamentally different to somewhere else? And I'm sure you are probably aware, given the think tank you are from, that we have recently published a paper calling for the abolishment of Homes England and devolving that, because again, it is ludicrous that we have a national body that, to be fair, when it was originally introduced, did some quite good stuff to get house building going. But you'd kind of have to ask yourself the question, well, if we're so far short of the house building targets now, and we have barriers left, right and centre from building homes, probably one of the most important things that we need to do in this country to get growth going, to get economic opportunity for younger generations to feel like they have a stake in the country, then actually maybe the infrastructure we have in place is not fit for purpose. But actually, there's a lot of metro mayors who are doing quite interesting things around building at the moment, like really interesting things, and doing it in conjunction with their local communities. So actually, the whole kind of NIMBY response is lessened because you can do it in an area, you can have the conversation, you can understand the types of homes you want, and you can then work with companies and businesses and planning within a local area. So absolutely, I think devolution offers a massive opportunity to be breaking down not just the quango state, but also the massively over-centralised, kind of process-driven, bureaucratic, technocratic Whitehall that too often thinks it knows what's best, but is so far away from doing so.
I totally agree with all of that. I think we have to kind of get over something which used to be, it's much more of a kind of a concern of the left than of the centre-right. But everything's got to be the same. Uniformity is somehow unfair if different decisions get made in one place from another. Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't have local decision-taking and localism, which I deeply believe in, and expect everything to be the same. I mean, people used to use this phrase, the postcode lottery. You mustn't have a postcode lottery in healthcare. Well, why not? It isn't a lottery. It's postcode decision-taking, which is locally accountable, and that's kind of good, and we need to get over it. We're a country which, for a long time, has been very centralized in terms of the powers of central government versus local and regional and devolved government. But actually, within central government, an extraordinarily weak center of government. And it's kind of the wrong way around. That's the kind of tight, loose balance, utterly the wrong way around.
We have a lady at the front here.
Hello, my name is Kay Martin. I have a cafe, and I have been badly impacted by the ignorance of the quangos. I've been to see the Low Pay Commission. They had never spoken to a micro business. I've spoken to the Resolution Foundation. Nobody there has ever worked in business, ever. And yet they're making decisions that are likely to put my business out of business. And I don't understand where that comes from. How can we change it? The Resolution Foundation want to reduce the VAT threshold to £30,000. The Labour government are going along with these sorts of things because they're trying to rake in money. I've literally just started closing one day a week to get underneath the threshold because I cannot afford the extra 12,000. And in addition, the Office of National Statistics has not got data on self-employed people. The minimum wage is determined with London wages, but no self-employed people. And so we are being screwed by quangos that seem to have immense power. But if you paraphrase J.K. Rowling, they're so intelligent, they got no intelligence. They just don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I worry about that for micro businesses.
This sort of turns out to be a casework session.
Yeah,
It's
it's
really,
brilliant.
it's fantastic. It's like a quango surgery almost. It's,
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, Kate. You're not. I'm afraid you're not only being screwed by the quangos. You're being screwed by the government as well. And there's, as is famously the case, there's no one in the cabinet who's ever worked in business. And my goodness me, does it show? And no, it's awful what you're going through. But this is to the point when you have a sort of cadre of people who become totally isolated from many of the realities of the world, and and they're left in charge of setting the rules. This is the outcome. So look, we need to get control of it. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. I'll take one from this side. This gentleman at the front here, closest to me, please shimmy in.
Hi, my name is James. I'm a member.
You got more casework by any chance?
No. It's a rhetorical question followed by a sort of proposed solution. If we are to assume that quangos or the civil service will make decisions on behalf of elected officials, which is inevitable, what training do civil servants or quango decision makers have? And what training could they get to make them more useful to elected officials?
Well, I mean, a very distinguished former permanent secretary described in a lecture he delivered on civil service reform a few years ago the civil service's approach to training or learning and development, as it's called these days, as comically lacking. There's a massive gap in the capability on implementation, and there's loads of things behind that. It's the people who are responsible for implementation of actually making things happen are the cross-cutting functions, procurement, operational delivery, financial management, HR, project management, all these things. And people in the civil service who are in those occupations, in those functions, are half as likely to have senior civil service status as the civil servants who are in the white collar, what I think of as the white collar policy occupations. And they are, and the people, the white collar policy mandarins, are overwhelmingly likely to get the top jobs, and there is a lack of status for people who do the work of making it happen, who do the how, and they tend to be very insulated from ministers. So policy gets developed in a vacuum, way away from the people who do implementation. And so you get none of that kind of pushback that enables you to say, to hear what you want to achieve will not be achieved effectively by this policy. I remember when IDS was developing the universal credit project, which was a good project and the right thing to do. I mean, the right idea. But I mean, policy was being developed in Whitehall. Implementation was being done in Sheffield, and the IT was being done in Warrington. Surprise, surprise, it didn't work. And there was one magic moment when IDS had asked me to put some of our central team in, particularly the GDS team in, to support it. When they were working, the GDS team were working in close proximity to IDS. Every 2 weeks they would do a show and tell. This is what we developed, the kind of prototype digital delivery of the policy. And actually the policy was able to be iterated literally fortnight by fortnight by interaction between policy, the people doing policy, and the people who were responsible for making it happen. It was a completely revolutionary idea.
Charlotte, I think
Whitehall.
you want to come in just with a quick few comments before we wrap up?
Yeah, just very briefly, and as one of the advisors to IDS at that time, it was also just brilliant that we had then had a model where the ministers were actually being informed regularly, which is the other thing that that wasn't happening. I think it's not just about training, actually. I think we get very, very obsessed about training. Francis is absolutely right about what we prioritise and where the status is within civil service and public bodies. But it's also about the lack of porosity between, like, the civil service and external, you know, like, why don't we have civil servants more frequently going out and working in businesses, whether that's micro or global, or why don't we have people going and working in, you know, local authorities or NHS trusts and things, so that you get a much better kind of interaction between that, whereas a lot of the people are literally coming through. And I remember one permanent secretary saying to us in an interview, the trouble is that a lot of the leaders in the civil service have never seen anything else, so how are you going to ask them to do something differently? So I think there's something about how actually we get different experiences and different people in, and maybe some of those civil servants should get out and go and visit businesses like Kay's and actually understand what's happening on the ground, because again, one of the massive problems with the civil service is so defensive, so insular. The only people it really talks to are, whether it's in charities, it's the massive charities that are in no way representative of the grassroots organisations many of you will be in contact with. It's the massive global businesses, not businesses like Kay's that are, you know, micro. So actually just exposure to things outside of Whitehall and outside of the civil service, I think, is one of the best things you could do, rather than trying to focus on some tick box online training, which is what on the whole you get.
On that note, I think it's very clear that in the Conservative movement and in the think tank movement, the answers and the solutions are there. We just need to get some people into government. So can I please ask if the audience can thank my panel in the usual way? And thank you everyone for coming, and do please stick around and check out the what else we've got on at the think tank over the next couple of days, because we've got a full schedule of events that I hope to see many of you at.
Thank you, Elliot.
Cheers.